The thermometer nailed to the wall of the operations shack had stopped being useful around noon. After 118 degrees Fahrenheit, the red line simply pressed against the top of the tube and stayed there, indifferent, as though the instrument itself had given up trying to measure something that no longer had a ceiling. Forward operating base ridgeline sat in a bowl carved by ancient wind between two sandstone ridges in a stretch of desert so featureless that new arrivals spent their first 3 days convinced they were lost. The base had no official name on any unclassified document. It had no permanent structure beyond a cluster of hardened containers, 2 generator sheds, a motor pool, and the operations shack itself, a reinforced trailer dragged out here by people who had learned long ago that permanence was a liability. It was July. The second week of July, which meant the wind off the flats carried grit fine enough to get behind eyelids, and the metal walls of every container radiated heat long after midnight. Soldiers stopped touching their weapons with bare hands around 10 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, they stopped moving unless they had to. SEAL Team 7's Bravo element had been on base for 6 days following what the after-action report would later describe, with careful bureaucratic understatement, as a mission with suboptimal outcomes. 3 objectives, 1 partial completion. 2 men returned with wounds that required medevac. Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway had not come back at all. The team was tired, in the specific, dirty way that comes not from physical exhaustion alone, but from the compound weight of exhaustion plus failure plus grief that hasn't yet been given permission to surface. They moved through the base with the compressed, inward energy of people maintaining discipline through force of will rather than genuine steadiness. Into this environment, on the morning of the 7th day, the dog began to change. His name was Ranger, 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 91 pounds, SEAL K-9 program trained in explosive detection, apprehension, and direct action support. He had served 2 deployments before this one and had a service record that, had he been capable of reading it, might have made him smug. He was not, by any account, a gentle animal in the way that word implies softness. He was precise, controlled, obedient to a degree that could look like gentleness from a distance, the way a loaded weapon sitting still on a table can look like an object at rest. His handler, according to every database the team had access to, was Sergeant First Class Derek Holloway. At 0700, Ranger ate his morning ration without issue and allowed Corporal Travis Beam to conduct a routine equipment check, harness, tracking, collar, paw inspection. At 0740, when Beam attempted to clip the leash for a perimeter walk, Ranger turned and snapped at his hand. Not a warning snap, a full, committed bite that missed only because Beam had good reflexes and had been working dogs long enough to read the shoulder drop that preceded it. Beam stepped back. Ranger stood in the center of the kennel space, a 10 by 10 section of reinforced container, and his body language had shifted into something none of the men present had seen from him before. His weight was forward, his ears were flat. The sound coming from his chest was low and constant, a vibration more than a vocalization, like something in his sternum had come loose and was resonating against his ribs. Lieutenant Commander Owen Garrett was notified within 2 minutes. He arrived to find Beam holding a compression bandage to his forearm, not from the bite itself, which had missed, but from the corner of the kennel door that had caught him when he reflexively threw himself backward. Garrett looked at the dog. The dog looked at Garrett. The sound from Ranger's chest did not change. "When did this start?" Garrett asked. "Just now," Beam said. "Nothing gradual. I went in for the leash clip like normal and he just turned." Garrett had worked with Ranger on the previous deployment. He had seen the dog locate a buried pressure plate in the dark, in rain, at a distance that the manufacturer of the equipment they were using claimed was theoretically impossible. He had seen Ranger clear a structure in 4 minutes that would have taken a human team 12. He did not dismiss what he was looking at as random malfunction, but he also could not afford to have a 91-pound combat dog with full bite capability running loose in a base that was already operating on frayed nerves. 3 men attempted to approach the kennel over the next 40 minutes, using progressively more elaborate combinations of restraint equipment and voice commands. Ranger attacked each attempt with escalating fury. The 3rd attempt ended with Sergeant Miles Connolly on the ground outside the kennel door with a shredded sleeve and a 4-inch laceration across his forearm that required 8 stitches. By 0900, Garrett had made 2 phone calls. The first was to the nearest veterinary support unit, which was 4 hours out by vehicle. The second was to the base commander, Colonel Francis Vane, who listened to the summary and said, in the flat voice of a man who had learned to strip emotion out of operational decisions. "If you can't control the asset by 1400, you know what the protocol says." Garrett did know what the protocol said. He stood outside the kennel container in the hammering heat and watched Ranger pace the length of his space, not frantic, not random, but with the specific, deliberate movement of an animal watching something the humans around him had not yet seen. The dog was not having a breakdown. Garrett had spent enough time in combat to recognize the difference between an animal in psychological crisis and an animal in a state of acute alertness that the people around it had mistaken for aggression. The distinction was subtle. It lived in the eyes. Ranger's eyes were not the eyes of a broken thing. They were the eyes of something paying very close attention. Garrett just didn't know yet what it was paying attention to. The helicopter came in from the southwest at 1042. Low and fast in the way that suggested the pilot had been briefed on the base's exposure profile and had made decisions accordingly. It touched down in the motor pool clearing, raised a wall of grit that sent two mechanics diving for cover, and sat spinning for 30 seconds before the door opened. One person got out. She moved across the clearing with a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. The pace of someone who had calculated exactly how fast they needed to move, and was moving at precisely that speed and no faster. She carried a single hard case, olive drab, with the weight distribution of a long rifle, and a pack that rode high and tight against her back. She was tall, athletic in the way that suggests functional training rather than aesthetic training, the difference between someone who has learned to move efficiently under load and someone who lifts for mirrors. Her hair was the color of pale sand and pulled back in a way that suggested she had solved the question of hair in the field once and permanently, and had not thought about it since. She wore no rank insignia on the uniform she was wearing, which was the right uniform for this environment, but carried none of the unit patches that would tell you where she had come from. Her name, according to the orders that had preceded her by 18 minutes via encrypted channel, was Captain Wren Calloway. The orders specified that she was to be afforded full base access and operational cooperation. They did not specify why she was here or who had sent her. The classification level on the orders was high enough that Garrett had read them 3 times, not because they were complex, but because he was trying to determine what they did not say. They did not say much. Garrett met her at the edge of the motor pool. He introduced himself and she shook his hand firm. Brief, no performance in it. "The briefing said you have a K9 situation," she said. "Belgian Malinois. 4 years old. Service record that would embarrass most humans." Garrett paused. "He started going after people this morning. We've had 1 injury requiring stitches. The protocol clock is running." She didn't respond to that immediately. She looked past him, toward the cluster of containers, as though she were already oriented to where the kennel was. Despite having never been to this base before, "Can I see him?" she asked. "You can try," Garrett said. "Nobody's been able to get within 10 feet. She didn't say anything to that. She just started walking. The men gathered outside the kennel container gave her a range of looks, the specific combination of skepticism and hope that collects around any person who arrives claiming they can handle a situation that has so far resisted all handling. Sergeant Connolly was among them, his arm newly bandaged, watching with the particular expression of someone who has been bitten and is weighing whether to feel protective or merely spectatorial about whoever steps into the same space next. Calloway did not step into the space. She stopped at the entrance to the container, leaned against the doorframe, and looked at the dog. Ranger was in the far corner. He had been pacing, but when she appeared in the doorway, he stopped. His head came up. The low sound in his chest that the men had been listening to all morning changed, not disappearing, but shifting in frequency, the way a radio changes when it finds the right station. "Don't go in," she said. Her voice was quiet and directed behind her, toward the men. "Don't stand near the entrance. Give him space. He'll attack if he beams started." "He won't attack me," she said. The certainty in her voice was not the certainty of arrogance. It was the certainty of someone stating a structural fact. The way you might say a bridge won't collapse because you are the engineer who designed it. She stood in the doorway for 4 minutes. Nobody spoke. The heat pressed down on all of them. Ranger stood in his corner and watched her, and the sound in his chest slowly, over those 4 minutes, softened and stilled. Then he walked toward her, not fast, not aggressive. He crossed the kennel space in a straight line, stopped 18 inches from where she was standing, and sat down. His posture settled. His ears came up from their defensive flat and moved to the position slightly angled forward, slightly tilted that handlers called interested. He was not attacking. He was not threatening. He was waiting. Calloway crouched down slowly, extended one hand. and the dog put his nose against her palm. Behind her, someone said, quietly, "What the hell?" And she turned and looked at them all for a moment with an expression that gave nothing away, and said, "I need to talk to your commanding officer." The meeting with Garrett and Colonel Vane lasted 9 minutes. Calloway sat across the folding table from 2 men who outranked her on paper and who were managing the specific discomfort of a situation in which the person with the most relevant information was not the person they had expected to have it. She spoke in short, declarative sentences. She did not offer context she wasn't asked for. She answered the question of how she knew the dog with a response that was technically complete and emotionally minimal. "I worked with him before. We know each other." She did not explain what before meant. She did not explain the gap. Colonel Vane pressed on the point, and she said, "That's classified at a level above this conversation," and the way she said it was not a dodge. It was a precise statement of fact, delivered without any apparent awareness that it might seem evasive. It was simply the situation, and she was describing it. Vane accepted this. People at his level of the organization had learned, through hard repetition, that there were categories of information that came in below them, and that the frustration of not being able to see the whole picture was a structural feature of the job rather than a personal slight. What Calloway asked for was this: do not execute the dog, and give her 4 hours to assess the situation. What she got was 3 hours. A provisional operational authority that stopped short of command but gave her freedom of movement and the right to make recommendations that would carry weight, and the visible skepticism of every man in the room. She accepted all of this and walked back to the kennel. It was while she was crouched outside the kennel, with Ranger sitting calm beside her, that the near disaster happened. Private First Class Dustin Farr was 23 years old and had the specific combination of qualities that tends to create exactly one type of problem in high-stakes environments. He was brave, he was not yet fully wise, and he wanted very much to prove something. He had watched Calloway calm the dog and had arrived at the conclusion, somewhat quickly and without much evidence, that the situation had been overstated. The dog was fine, probably just needed someone to talk to it the right way. He could do that. He came around the corner of the container with the intention of demonstrating this. Ranger saw him at approximately the same moment Calloway heard his footsteps, and the dog was off the ground and moving before Calloway had fully turned. She caught Ranger's harness with both hands and her full body weight and pulled him back, and the impact dropped her to one knee in the gravel. Ranger's jaws snapped shut on empty air 6 inches from Farr's face. Farr stumbled backward into the container wall and stood there with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood, physically and immediately, that they were about to receive serious injury. "Back up," Calloway said. Her voice was still level. She was on one knee in the gravel holding 91 pounds of straining dog with both hands, and her voice had not changed. "Slowly, don't run." Farr backed up. His face had lost its color. Garrett arrived at the sound of it, weapon drawn, and saw the scene: Calloway on one knee, the dog restrained, Farr against the wall uninjured, and the weapon went back to low ready without being fired. "Stand down," Calloway said. "Don't shoot. I have him." "Farr," Garrett said, in the voice of a man deciding how to process what he was seeing before addressing what should have been obvious, "get away from that section of the base." "Now," Farr went. Calloway held the dog until his body relaxed 30 seconds, maybe 40, and then released him and stood. She turned to look at where Farr had been standing, then at the container wall behind him, then at the ground between the container and the perimeter fence. Her expression had shifted. Something had gone from thoughtful to certain, the way a face changes when a theory becomes a conclusion. "I need to talk to everyone," she said, "right now. Not just you, everyone on base." They gathered in the operations shack. 12 men, plus Vane and Garrett. The room was designed for 8, and held the specific atmosphere of too many people breathing recycled air in insufficient space. The generator outside kept the one functioning cooling unit running, which brought the internal temperature down to something slightly below unbearable. Calloway stood at the front of the room, and did not use any of the briefing materials the shack contained. She didn't need them. She told them about Ranger. She told them without telling them about herself, which was a careful navigation that she had clearly done before presenting the relevant information while leaving one piece of the architecture invisible. The men in the room understood dogs well enough to understand what she was telling them about this dog. What she told them was this: Ranger had been trained. in his advanced K9 program work beyond standard explosive detection. He had been trained in something called environmental threat response, a protocol developed specifically for sustained deployment environments, in which the dog learned to flag not just the presence of a specific substance but the presence of a threat pattern. The difference was significant. Standard explosive detection was object finding. ETR was behavioral analysis of an entire environment over time. It made the dog, in the right circumstances, something close to a continuous sensor, one that processed data the way no electronic system could, because it was integrating information across smell, sound, air movement, ground vibration, and the behavioral cues of every human being in the environment simultaneously. What you were seeing this morning wasn't aggression disorder, she said. It was ETR activation. He was flagging the environment. Flagging what? Connolly asked. His bandaged arm was on the table in front of him. That's what we need to determine, she said. Garrett watched her. He had been a good officer for a long time, and one of the things that made him good was that he noticed what was underneath what people said. What was underneath what Calloway was saying was that she understood this dog's training with the intimacy of someone who had not merely studied it but had participated in it. The way she described the ETR protocol, the specific language, the sequencing of the explanation, the details she chose to include, it was not the description of a person who had read a file. He said nothing yet. She told them about ETR activation specifically. The dog would display aggressive territorial behavior toward individuals approaching areas he had flagged as potentially compromised. He would not simply alert sitting, standing, staring. He would actively prevent access. It could look like a breakdown. It was designed to look like a breakdown if you didn't know what you were looking at, because a dog that merely sat and alerted could be overridden by a soldier who didn't understand or didn't care. A dog that attacked could not be easily overridden. The room was quiet. He was protecting you, she said. All of you. He just couldn't tell you from what. The inspection took 40 minutes. Calloway moved through the base, with Ranger on a long lead, not the standard 6-foot working lead but a 20-foot line that gave the dog room to range while keeping him connected to her. She let him lead. She followed his movement and watched where he went and, more importantly, where he would not go. The men watched from a distance. Garrett walked parallel to her at approximately 30 feet, close enough to intervene if the situation required intervention, far enough that he wasn't in the operational space she was using. There was a section of the base, a triangular area between the eastern generator shed, the second container block, and the perimeter fence where Ranger would not enter. Not simply reluctant, not merely hesitant, would not. Every approach angle, every approach from every direction, produced the same result. The dog's body would drop low, his movement would slow, and he would begin to circle the boundary of the area without crossing it, the way water moves around a stone. Calloway watched this for 10 minutes from different angles. Then she crouched and looked at the ground of the flagged area from outside its boundary. The surface of the base was compacted sand, gravel, some concrete pads in the high-traffic areas. The flagged section was gravel, and the gravel looked like all the other gravel. Uniform, unremarkable, indistinguishable, to human eyes, from the 700 other square meters of gravel surface within the perimeter fence. She didn't touch anything. She stood and called Garrett over. That section, she said. He looked at it. What about it? When was the last time someone walked through there? He thought about it. The generator shed is on the other side. People go to the shed 3-4 times a day. He paused. But not through that specific section. There's a path that goes around it. Why? He looked at the path, then at the section. He had been on this base for 7 days and had used the path himself and had never asked why the path went around the section rather than through it. The path existed and he had used it, and it had not occurred to him to interrogate its existence. I don't know, he said. Find out, she said. Find out when that path formed and who formed it and whether anyone remembers walking directly through that section after the first 48 hours of base establishment. He made 2 calls. The answers came back in 8 minutes. The path had formed organically in the second day of occupation. Nobody remembered deciding to route around the gravel section. Nobody remembered being told to. It had simply happened. The way behavior sometimes does, when some part of the human nervous system has registered something that the conscious mind has not yet articulated. Ranger had not been the only one feeling it. He had been the only one who understood what he was feeling. Calloway stood at the edge of the flagged section and looked at it with the expression of someone reading a text in a language others couldn't see. Behind her, Garrett was on a second phone call, this one longer. His voice low and urgent. What are we looking at? She said. more to herself than to anyone. Ranger sat beside her and looked at exactly the same section of ground. The explosive ordnance disposal team arrived 3 hours and 40 minutes after Calloway's call, which was, by the physics and logistics of their location, as fast as they could have arrived. Colonel Vane had made the request at Calloway's recommendation, and he had made it with enough weight that it had not been questioned at the receiving end, which said something about how the information had been packaged and conveyed. While they waited, Calloway walked the rest of the perimeter with Ranger. She found 2 more sections. One was near the motor pool access gate, a strip of ground approximately 3 feet wide that ran parallel to the gate's swing arc. One was near the main operations shack entrance, tucked against the wall, in a location where feet passed every time someone entered or exited the building. Garrett followed her through both discoveries and said less and less as the pattern became clearer. They weren't targeting a single objective, she said when they had completed the circuit. They were targeting traffic patterns, highest probability contact areas. If all 3 are Garrett started, don't assume anything until EOD clears them, she said. But yes, if all 3 are what I think they are, someone with knowledge of this base's operational patterns placed them deliberately, someone who had been watching long enough to know where people walk. The implication sat in the heat between them. They'd have to have been watching for days, she said. Minimum. And Ranger knew? Ranger has been trying to tell you since she stopped, reconsidered, since the person who understood his signals wasn't available to receive them. Garrett looked at her. He had been building a question since the helicopter had landed, and she had looked at the kennel from across the motor pool with the orientation of someone who already knew where it was. He built it now into words. You worked with him before, he said. You said that. Yes. How long ago? A pause. Not evasion calculation. The calculation of someone deciding how much of a true answer they can give without crossing a line they've been given. Long enough that he should have forgotten my smell, she said. He didn't, because dogs don't forget the people who mattered to them. The same way they don't stop responding to a command taught by a handler who's been gone for 2 years. The learning is physiological, it's deeper than memory. She paused. He knew I was here before anyone told him. That's why his behavior changed when I arrived, not calmed down. Changed. He shifted from general alarm to directed communication, because suddenly there was someone present who could receive it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, the file for his previous handler has gaps. She said nothing. Classified gaps, he said. She said nothing. You don't have to confirm it, he said. But I want you to know I'm not asking to satisfy curiosity. I'm asking because the men on this base are going to trust you with their lives in the next several hours. And people trust more completely when they understand why they should. She looked at him for a moment with an assessment that was thorough and not unkind. His previous handler left the unit for a different assignment, she said. The assignment required a record that didn't include K9 work, so the K9 record was removed. She paused. He didn't lose his handler. His handler was just relocated somewhere the paperwork couldn't follow. And Holloway, Garrett said carefully, was assigned to Ranger 8 months ago. Ranger worked with him. Ranger is well trained enough to work with anyone competent. She paused again. But trained loyalty and original loyalty aren't the same thing. Garrett absorbed this. I'm sorry about Holloway, she said. It was quiet and direct and clearly meant. He was good, Garrett said. I know, she said. I read his file. The EOD team confirmed 2 of the 3 locations within 90 minutes of their arrival. The third, the strip near the motor pool gate, was a false positive. Compacted ground with a mineral composition that had apparently triggered Ranger's response without justification. The 2 confirmed locations contained devices that the EOD team lead, Master Sergeant Bradley Finch, described in his preliminary report as sophisticated, low signature, designed for high traffic detonation with remote override capability. Remote override capability meant someone could choose to trigger them from a distance rather than waiting for foot traffic, which meant whoever had placed them was possibly still in range. This changed the nature of the problem. We need to find the operator, Calloway said. Vane looked at the EOD report, and then at Calloway, and then at Garrett. We have electronic surveillance. Electronic surveillance in this environment, against this type of operator, at the range they'd need to be operating from. She stopped herself from completing the sentence in the way she might have completed it, which was with the word useless. Instead she said, will be slower than what I'm proposing. What she was proposing was this. She and Ranger, with a 2-man element for security, move outside the perimeter and track the observation position. The devices had been placed with knowledge of the base's traffic patterns. That knowledge had been gathered from somewhere. The somewhere would have specific characteristics, sight lines, concealment, approach routes. Rangers' ETR training included exterior tracking components designed for exactly this scenario. Vane said, "You're proposing to take my men outside the wire with a dog and a—" "Yes," she said, "with a dog and a plan that amounts to following a dog. The dog," she said, "has already been right twice today." There was a silence in the operations shack. "Two men," Vane said, "Sergeant Hollister and Corporal Reeves. They're both qualified for close support. You'll have radio contact at all times and you'll break contact at my discretion." "Understood," she said. They went out through the north gate at 1547. The desert outside the perimeter was a different environment than the inside in the way that all controlled spaces differ from what surrounds them. The outside had no path, no established routes, nothing that said people have been here. The sand was wind-rippled and undisturbed except where the occasional vehicle had passed on the track that led toward the nearest supply point, 40 miles northwest. Ranger moved differently outside the wire. Inside, his movement had been contained, alert, watchful, but constrained by structures and walls and the presence of many people. Outside, he expanded. His range extended to the full length of the 20-foot lead and then pressed against it, not pulling frantically but with a steady, directional tension that was clearly navigational rather than reactive. He was not simply moving. He was moving towards something. Calloway read the terrain as she moved through it. This was a skill as automatic to her as breathing, the continuous environmental processing that her training had made involuntary. She read the wind, from the northwest, 6 to 9 miles per hour, consistent. She read the ground. The near surface was soft sand over a harder substrate. Footprints, if any had been made in the last 12 hours, would still be partially visible in sheltered depressions between the wind ripples. She read the light, mid-afternoon, high sun, deep shadows only near the larger rock formations to the east. The rock formations to the east were the only natural concealment within the line-of-sight range required for remote operation of the devices. Ranger was moving east. Sergeant Marcus Hollister walked at her left rear and Corporal James Reeves at her right rear. Both men were quiet and competent. She had assessed them in the 3 minutes before departure and had arrived at the conclusion that they would not do anything impulsive. This was the most important quality she needed from them. The rock formations were approximately 1,800 meters from the base perimeter. In the heat, with the ground radiating stored warmth upward through the soles of their boots, the walk took 34 minutes. Ranger's behavior changed at approximately 1,400 meters. The directional tension on the lead shifted from continuous to pulsed. He would pull forward, pause, raise his head, test the air, then pull forward again. The intervals between pulses shortened as they approached. At 1,600 meters, he stopped entirely and sat. Calloway crouched beside him. She followed his gaze, not his nose, his gaze, because he was looking rather than scenting to a specific rock formation ahead and to the left. A limestone outcropping approximately 12 meters high, with a natural shelf at approximately the 8-meter mark that would provide both concealment and a clear view of the base. The shelf was in shadow. She studied it. She said, very quietly, to Hollister, "Radio, tell them we've located a probable observation position. Give them the bearing. Tell them we are not approaching. We are establishing observation." Hollister made the call. She studied the shelf for 4 minutes. The shadow was consistent. The rock was still. The wind moved across it without disturbing anything. Then it disturbed something. A small thing. A flicker at the shelf's right edge that was not rock and was not shadow, the edge of something that had shifted, perhaps a degree or two, perhaps in response to the wind, or perhaps in response to the awareness that something had changed in the environment below. She said, "There." She unshipped the hard case. She had not opened it since the helicopter. Now, she set it on the flattest section of ground available, a depression between two wind ridges that gave her a natural low profile, and opened the latches and assembled the rifle with the speed of someone who has performed this action enough times that it no longer requires conscious direction from the higher brain. Hands and muscle and trained automaticity doing the work while the eyes and mind stayed on the problem. The rifle was a custom long-range precision platform chambered in 338 Lapua Magnum. The optic was a high-power variable, currently set to maximum magnification. There was no bipod. She shot supported on a pack, which she positioned under the forend with a precision that looked casual and was not. She settled behind the gun. The range to the shelf was 1,840 meters, by her estimation. She had no laser rangefinder. It was in her pack, and she did not take the time to retrieve it. She estimated from the visual size of the shelf relative to its known geological type, from the time the sound of a small rock dislodgement had taken to reach her in the last few seconds, from the thermal mirage layering between her and the target that gave her information about air density and gradient. These were not separate calculations. They happened simultaneously, unconsciously, the way reading a word happens not letter by letter but whole. She confirmed the wind, 6 to 8 miles per hour at ground level. The question was what it was doing at the shelf. The rock formation would create turbulence on the downrange face. She watched the thermal mirage for the characteristic shimmer patterns that indicated directional change at altitude. There was a person on that shelf. She could not yet see the person. She could see the indication of the person, the small rectangle of geometry against the irregular rock face that was too consistent in its angles to be natural, the faint dark mark at the shelf's edge. That was a shadow falling the wrong way for the sun angle. She could see the remote detonation equipment that the person was holding, because at 40x magnification in clear desert air over 1,840 meters, she could see approximately what she needed to see. Hollister was beside her, prone. Confirmed hostile, he said. Confirmed presence with detonation equipment, she said. Yes. Command is asking for confirmation before. Tell them I'm taking the shot, she said. She breathed out. The crosshairs settled. Long-range shooting, at its true extreme, is not about the rifle. The rifle is the last component of the system. Before the rifle is the shooter. And before the shooter's conscious mind is everything that training has built below consciousness, the capacity to hold position through the trigger brake, to call the shot before the round lands, to integrate wind and range and elevation and the body's own heartbeat into a single, unified act of attention. At 1,840 meters, a miss was a warning. A warning meant a detonation. A detonation meant people she had spent the day working to protect would die. She did not think about this. Thinking about it would have been noise. She thought about nothing. The trigger broke. The recoil came. She called the shot high right, correcting left, before she could have consciously processed what she'd seen, and then through the recovered optics she saw the shelf, and the indication of the person on the shelf, and the detonation equipment was no longer being held. Hollister's radio crackled. EOD. Back at the base. Devices are not responding. Remote signal has gone dark. Repeat. Remote signal has gone dark. Ranger, beside her, made a sound she had not heard him make in a long time. It was not a bark, and it was not a growl. It was the sound of a dog who had been waiting for something and had finally arrived at the end of the waiting. She lowered the rifle. The follow-up team went to the shelf at 1,714 and confirmed a single individual male, unmarked clothing, remote detonation equipment of a type consistent with the devices found inside the perimeter. The individual was incapacitated. The devices, EOD confirmed, had been designed to detonate simultaneously, time to maximum traffic periods, 0800, which was morning briefing, and 1,800, which was the end-of-day operations summary. The timing meant the operations shack entrance and the generator shed path, both high-traffic areas, would have been hit simultaneously during peak occupancy. Finch walked Garrett through the numbers. Quiet. Technical. 12 to 15 casualties minimum at the 0800 detonation window, given known traffic patterns. The 1,800 window potentially higher. Ranger flagged this, Finch said. It was not a question. Ranger flagged this, Garrett confirmed. How long ago? We don't know exactly. He started the ETR response yesterday afternoon, which is when Garrett paused. Which is when his behavior first changed. Yesterday afternoon, Finch said. Yesterday afternoon, Garrett said. We thought he was breaking down. Finch was quiet for a moment. He was trying to tell you the base was compromised, he said. Yes. And nobody understood him. Not until someone arrived who could. Finch looked across the base toward where Calloway was sitting outside the kennel, the dog beside her. He looked for a while. Then he went back to his equipment. Inside the operations shack, Garrett wrote his after-action notes and thought about the day. He thought about Ranger on the morning, 91 pounds of controlled aggression, driving 3 trained soldiers back from a section of ground, unable to communicate what he knew in any language they could understand. He thought about what it costs to know something urgent and have no way to say it. He thought about the path that had formed organically around the flagged section in the second day of base occupation, all those feet, all those mornings and evenings, quietly routing around something that the human nervous system had registered and not articulated. He thought about Calloway. about the gaps in her record and what filled them, about the specific quality of her attention, the way she had stood in the doorway of the kennel and simply waited, without coaxing, without commands, without any of the elaborate approach strategies the trained handlers had attempted. She had simply appeared and waited, as though she understood that the dog needed time to confirm what he already knew rather than time to be convinced of something new. She had understood him because she had built him, or enough of him that the relevant parts remained. He thought about what that cost to be erased from a record. To lose the operational relationship that had been the center of your working life, to know that an animal you had trained was serving in a war zone without you, being interpreted by people who didn't have the right dictionary. He closed his notes. Outside, the sun was going down. The temperature dropped from unbearable to merely uncomfortable over the course of 45 minutes, which in this environment felt like mercy. The sky went through a sequence of colors that had nothing to apologize for: orange, giving way to something deeper, the horizon going red, the rock formations to the east throwing long shadows back toward the base. Colonel Vane came to Garrett's doorway. "EOD is wrapping up," Vane said. "Both devices cleared and secured." "Good. I need to do a formal debrief with Calloway. She'll cooperate within her classification limitations," Garrett said. "I know." Vane was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about her." "Yes. I'm going to say that to her. I think she'd appreciate that," Garrett said. "Though she won't show it." Vane almost smiled. "No, she won't." She was sitting on an overturned equipment crate outside the kennel when Vane found her. Ranger was beside her. Not leashed, not restrained. He was simply there, in the way that dogs who have found their person are simply there without agenda, without the performance of presence, just the fact of it. His head was resting on her knee. His eyes were closed. Vane stood a few feet away and looked at the two of them for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. She waited. "I set a 1,400 deadline on that dog," he said. "If you had arrived an hour later—" "I didn't arrive an hour later," she said. "No. But I want to say it anyway. The protocol exists for a reason, and I applied it without enough information, and I should have." He stopped. Found the right word. "I should have looked harder at what he was actually doing before I decided what it meant." She was quiet for a moment. The sun was a hand's width above the western ridge. "The protocol is right," she said. "A dog that can't be controlled in a combat environment is a liability. You were doing your job." "I was doing my job without enough understanding of the situation," he said. "Yes," she said, "without heat. That's a different thing." He nodded. He stood for another moment, looking at the dog. "Is he going to be all right? Without, I mean, going forward." She looked down at Ranger. Her hand moved to the side of his neck and rested there. "He'll serve," she said. "He's a good dog. He'll bond with a new handler in time." A pause. "He'll miss this. The continuity. But he's not fragile." "Are you going to request a transfer back to K9? Vane asked. The question was more personal than anything he had asked her all day. She absorbed it without flinching. "That's not my decision," she said. "But if it were?" She looked at the horizon. The red was deepening. Somewhere out on the desert floor, a thermal current lifted a small spiral of dust and dispersed it. "I'd stay where I am," she said. "The work I do matters." She paused. This was an exception. He needed someone who spoke his language, and I happened to be available. Vane looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that might have been admiration and might have been something older and less comfortable, the recognition of a person who has organized their life around a decision they can't unmake, and who has made their peace with what that organization costs. "The team wants to thank you," he said. "They don't need to," she said. "No, but they will anyway." Garrett came out after Vane. He didn't say much. He sat on a second crate at a companionable distance, and they watched the sun go down together without filling the silence with words it didn't need. After a while, he said, "Connolly wanted me to tell you he doesn't blame the dog." She nodded. "Said if someone was sitting on top of a bomb in his neighborhood, he'd probably bite people too." Something moved in her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Tell him thank you. He also wants to know if the dog has any openings in his schedule for a formal apology." This time, the smile completed itself. It was brief. It changed her face considerably. "Tell him he can come by in the morning. Early." Garrett nodded. He looked at Ranger. The dog hadn't opened his eyes, but his tail moved once, slowly, side to side. The motion of a dog who is asleep in the way that is more rest than unconsciousness, who is aware of the people around him and has decided they are not a threat. "He really knew," Garrett said. "From the beginning." "From before the beginning," she said. From whenever they put the first device in the ground, he was in the kennel and he could smell it, and he knew something was wrong and nobody knew what he was saying. How long was he signaling before we noticed? Long enough, she said. The words carried weight that she didn't expand on. They sat with that for a moment. The debrief tomorrow is going to ask about your history with him, Garrett said. I wanted to warn you. I know. I won't add anything to what you don't say yourself. She looked at him. The assessment again, thorough, direct, not unkind. Thank you, she said. It was the most unguarded thing she had said all day. The base at night was a different organism than the base in the afternoon heat. The generators ran and the cooling units ran and the temperature dropped to something that could be lived in without effort. The light over the operations shack made a yellow circle on the gravel. Somewhere in the motor pool, someone was working late on something mechanical. The sound of it, steady and purposeful, reached the eastern side of the base in a way that felt like company. Calloway sat outside the kennel until Ranger was fully asleep. Then she stood and looked at him for a moment at the rise and fall of his breathing. The particular stillness of a dog deeply at rest, the way his ears still moved slightly in response to sounds below human hearing range. And then she walked back to the quarters she had been assigned and sat on the edge of the bunk in the dark for a while. She thought about the things she could not carry openly, the record that had been erased, the deployment she could not document, the 4 years since she had walked away from a kennel and a dog who had not understood why she was leaving and had not been able to be told. She thought about the morning, the moment she had stood in the doorway and seen him across the kennel space, and the shift in his chest, and the 4 minutes of stillness while something in him confirmed what it had registered before he had any right to register it. He had known her. Across whatever had happened to both of them in the intervening years, the distance, the reassignments, the silence, he had known her. She thought about what it meant that a dog's loyalty was physiological, that it lived below the level of reason, below the level of explanation, below the level of paperwork and classification and the operational architecture that moved people around the world like pieces on a board, that it survived erasure. There was something in that she could not quite name. Something that was not comfort exactly, and not grief exactly, and not pride exactly, but lived in the same territory as all three. Outside, the desert night made no sound. Inside the kennel, a dog slept. And in the morning, there would be a debrief and forms to fill, and a helicopter that would come back and take her somewhere else with a hard case and a pack and a file that did not say everything it could have said. And Ranger would serve with a new handler who would learn his signals over time, who would earn his working trust, the way working trust is always earned, through repetition and reliability and the accumulated proof of days. But tonight, in the remaining hours of this one specific night in a desert that did not care about any of it, she was the person he had been waiting for. That was enough. It had to be enough. It was. In the morning, Corporal James Reeves found them both still outside. She had come back in the small hours and fallen asleep sitting against the kennel wall, and Ranger was pressed against the mesh beside her, one paw extended through the gap. Neither of them woke when Reeves arrived. He stood and looked at them for a long moment. Then he went and made coffee. Some things don't need to be reported. He set a cup outside the kennel door. It was still there when she woke up 90 minutes later. Still warm. Just barely, because the desert morning had not yet turned to heat and the cup had retained what it could. She drank it sitting against the kennel wall, and Ranger watched her with his head tilted at the angle she had always privately thought of as his paying attention look, ears slightly offset, one higher than the other, eyes tracking her face with the specific focus of an animal for whom human facial expression is a primary data source. She had taught him that, or rather, she had reinforced it. The capability was genetic, built into the breed over generations of selection, but the refinement, the directed attention, the habit of watching her face for information before acting, that had been her work, in hundreds of mornings and evenings over 2 years, in kennels and training fields and forward positions, through the long patience of building a working partnership from two very different kinds of intelligence, learning to speak a shared language. She looked at him now and thought, you kept the language. He had kept it across 4 years and reassignment and the silence that followed her departure. Kept it the way the body keeps the knowledge of how to swim long after the last swim. The knowledge had waited in him, patient and undiminished, for the moment it would be needed again. The morning sun came over the eastern ridge and painted the desert floor in pale gold. The base began its day around them, generators cycling up, boots on gravel, the distant sound of the motor pool coming to life. The world of operational routine reasserting itself over the compressed urgency of the previous day. Ranger put his head back down on his paws. She finished the coffee, In an hour, she would be back inside the machinery. Debriefs, reports, the careful management of what could be said and what could not, the return to the assignment she had come from and would return to. The rifle would go back in its case. The work would continue, as it always continued, in the places where paperwork did not follow. But for now, in the last of the cool morning, there was just this. A crate she had overturned to sit on, a cup that had been left for her by someone who had understood something without being told, and a dog who had waited without understanding why he was waiting, who had continued to do his job in the only language available to him, who had been right all along and had simply needed someone to listen. She reached through the kennel mesh and rested her hand on the side of his face. He didn't move, his eyes closed. The desert, for a moment, was very quiet.